Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Starfield. My name is Camel. In today's video, we are going to be touring the Alchiba system to act as an explorer's guide to the galaxy. We will be looking at each planet and moon, their stats, their resources, their traits, etc, etc, as so you can maybe find a new celestial body to call home. Now before we get started, two things. If I sound sick, well, I went to Red Mountain recently and I caught the Corpus 19. But Evadethir is helping me out with that, so if I sound deathly, it's because I am. This is not an inflection, this is an infection. And if you do hear any hammering in the background, I do apologize. Apparently, I live below Bob the Builder, as I don't know what they're doing to their floor, but it's getting hammered harder and more often than Sasha Grey in her prime. But back to Starfield. Now, I randomly chose the Alchiba system, as after about 400 hours of playtime in Starfield, I'd never visited it, so I have no idea what it has to offer, and I thought it'd be a fun experience if we explored it together. And I did go to space.com of all websites and check the pronunciation of the star, and it is Alchiba. Something along those lines anyway. It's not Alchiba, it's Alchiba. Now, if discovering things all throughout the galaxy interests you, my other Starfield videos can be found down in the description via the playlist link. Down there you can also find all of my social media links. Be sure to help me out and check them out after the video. That would be greatly appreciated. But for now, sit back and relax as I guide us through the Alchiba system in Starfield. Now on the star map, Alchiba can be found basically if you go straight to the middle of the map and then just down. It's all the way down here on the edge by itself. So probably much like me, you likely haven't been here either. But it turns out this is actually quite a large solar system. As we can see, there are 10 planets and 18 moons. So we do have quite a lot to explore in the solar system of Alchiba. So let's begin. We will start naturally at Alchiba I. This planet's type is rock, its gravity is 1.75, which is pretty high. Temperature is inferno, so about the same as Australian summer. The atmosphere is extra CO2, that's no good. Magnetosphere is average, no fauna, no flora, no water, and it has 4 resources, the first of which is nickel, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. Then we also have lead, which is again common with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. We can also find cobalt, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 12. And fourthly and finally, we can find palladium, which is an exotic resource with a mass of 0.7 but a value of 25, so pretty penny you can get from this. Now Alchiba I has 3 biomes. Firstly is hills. Now the hills biome isn't too interesting. There are some light brown sand and some rather dark volcanic looking rocks and sand as well. Interestingly, the sky glows with a scent of summer peach. Peppered about the place, we can find these purple and crimson crystals standing proud in the rather boring landscape. Usually surrounding them are these volcanic vents. Now the second biome that Alchiba I has to offer is the Plateau regions. Now at first glance it seems like a pretty boring desert. After all, it is a plateau, plateaus are flat, and this is pretty flat, both literally and metaphorically. When in regards to the excitement levels that it brings. The sand here seems to almost match the sky with that estival glow. Here and there we can spot these vents of some kind of unknown and unharvestable gas spewing from the surface. But if we venture a little longer, well, a plateau is only a plateau if there's something for it to be a flat-topped mountain in reference to, which is these canyons. Vast, huge, dare I call them grand canyons. Down in their basins, like pins in a pin cushion, we can find these rather odd and alien-looking stone structures, the remnants of much larger rocks that have been worn away over time. Erosion has had a hand in creating these obscure monoliths. And the third and final biome this planet has to offer is the rocky deserts. These seem to feel hotter. They look more saturated in color, redder, warmer, more fiery. Most of the sand is a pallid salmon, with these dark red-orange rocks, littered all about the place, and with some more rudimentary, perhaps sandstone monoliths. Now along with all of that, Alchiba I has 3 traits. Emerging tectonics, which I found in the form of these hot spring terraces, which are quite pretty but also look very sulfuric. Usually in nature, if something looks obscurely beautiful, it's probably deadly. The second trait is prismatic plumes, which I found in the form of these crystalline pools. Myriads of those barnacle-esque volcanic vents can be found scattered all about this area as well. Of course, with it being crystalline, there are giant crystal clusters clawing their way out of the planet's surface, with colors ranging from dark purple to pink to orange to light blue to cyan to indigo to a kind of sapphire dark blue, with a faint hint of a celestial light glowing within them. And the third and final trait that the planet has to offer is sonorous lithospheres, which I found in the form of these oscillating crystals, which, interestingly, unlike the other crystals, most of these ones are almost just charcoal in color. While there are still some that have blues and purples, for the most part it's pretty black and white, well, just black in this case. The strange rock formations match this blackness and give me a very strong sense of some kind of seismic, tectonic, volcanic activity creating them at some point. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour on this planet is the equivalent of 100 hours universal time, and 24 hours is the equivalent of 2400 hours universal time. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, this is the biggest ratio we can find in Starfield in regards to time passage on the planet versus universal time, a 1 to 100 ratio. Very handy for farming resources at your outpost. Build an outpost, then you wait on a planet like this, and suddenly, like 87 days of time has passed or something, go back to your outpost, and you have thousands of resources. So that could come in handy. Now, when you fully scan Alchiba I, the survey data is worth 9,000 credits. Now, this planet has no moons, so we will be moving on to the next planet, Alchiba II. Now, its type is rock. It's got a gravity of 0.71, not bad. Temperature is Inferno. Atmosphere is standard CO2, magnetosphere is average, no fauna, no flora, no water, but it does have 6 resources. Firstly, we can find iron, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 8, not very good. We can also find lead, which is another common resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. We may also run across uranium, which is again common, has a mass of 0.7 but worth 14. Then we have Alkanes, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 13. We can also find silver, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 20. And we can find iridium, which is an uncommon resource, again with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 14. Now, Alchiba II has 3 biomes, the first of which is the mountains region. Interestingly, it doesn't look too mountainous. There are mountains in the distance, but for the most part it kind of just feels like a flat desert. And while a bit bland, I think it is beautiful in its own deserty way. Interestingly, I did notice that the sky, while at first glance seems blue, it's actually a violet. A very light violet, but nonetheless I thought that was pretty cool. And while poking about the sand here, I was able to find some gas vents or steam vents, some kind of volcanic vent, I would guess, given the mass of embers spewing from within it. Which takes us onto the second biome, which is just volcanic. Which, as you might imagine, looks rather charred, scarred, and barren. There isn't much to see here. Everything's grey, the rocks are grey, the dirt is grey, the gravel is grey, the hills are grey, the sky's kinda grey. It's kind of like the king and queen of opposing chess sides had a baby and gave birth to a planet, and this is it. The most interesting thing I found in this volcanic region were these fiery cracks in the surface of the planet, spewing fire, embers, and soot, reminding me of Red Mountain, which I was at recently, where I caught Corpus 19. And the third and final biome that this planet has to offer is the sandy desert, and boy oh boy did it live up to the name. Anakin would hate it here. And to be fair, I also hate sand. At the beach, fine, but leave it at the beach, please. I don't want it in my house or my car or my bed. Oh, I hate it. Now, while there was a sandstorm whipping sand against my ankles the whole time I was here, it is quite beautiful. Interestingly, the sand is a kind of pink color, and the sky glows with that same summer peach scent that we saw on Alchiba I. So while rather inhospitable, it is quite beautiful. Now, this planet has one trait, and that is the gravitational anomaly, which, as I don my primitive caveman hat, looks magical. Because I don't understand the science of this, it's magic. But when you do find this trait, do not forget to mine all of the calamite peppered around the base of this gravitational anomaly. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour on this planet is the equivalent of 1 hour and 35 minutes in universal time, and 24 hours on this planet is the equivalent of 38 hours universal time. Nothing special here. And when you fully scan the planet, Alchiba II survey data is worth 9,000 credits. Moving on to our next celestial body, which is Alchiba II-a, which is a moon of the previous planet. Its type is barren, it's got a gravity of 0.08, which is one of the lowest I think I've seen. Temperature is inferno, no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, no water, but just 2 resources. Those being Helium-3, which has a blue diamond in its information plate, which implies that it's an uncommon resource, but the information plate says it's a common resource. So I don't quite know what's going on there, but it's got a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. And the second resource we can find on this planet is aluminum, which globally is recognized as aluminium, but in the United States is aluminum, and it's actually spelled differently too. And given I'm not from the United States, I will be calling it aluminium from here on out. Anyway, it's a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 7. Now, Alchiba II-a has one biome, that is craters. Although, unlike most moons, I find these craters somewhat interesting, with a pale yellow sand with dark red rocks. On occasion, we can also run across these metallic amalgams. These would appear to be the result of meteorites crashing onto the moon's surface. Although interestingly, it has the appearance of slag as a result of molten metal. But given there's no atmosphere here, there's nothing for a meteorite to rub against, there's no friction, there's no reason for it to get molten. So that's weird. Anyway, while being quite plain, it is one of the more beautiful kind of blank moons that I've run across. Now, 1 hour on this moon is the equivalent to 39 hours and 13 minutes in universal time. And 24 hours is the equivalent of 941 hours and 1 minute universal time. So this thing spins pretty slowly. Now, when you fully scan the moon, Alchiba II-a's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. Next, we have Alchiba III. Now, this is a gas giant, so we can't land on it. All we can do is scan it from our ship and collect the survey data, which is worth 4,500 credits. Next up is Alchiba III-a. This is of course a moon of the previous planet. Its type is ice, it's got a gravity of 0.15, its temperature is temperate, no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, no water, but it does have 5 resources. The first of which is classic water, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Secondly is Helium-3, which is a common/uncommon resource and has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. Then we have aluminium, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 7. Then there is lead, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. And finally, we have tungsten, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 16. And just so you know, even though you don't need to know, tungsten's periodic symbol is W, which stands for Wolfram, which sounds cool. And tungsten has the highest melting point of all known elements to man, except perhaps Bob Lazar's element 115, but we can't comment on that. Now, Alchiba III-a has 2 biomes, the first of which is craters, which, like most moons with craters as a biome, is pretty bland. Some rocks here and there, some little gas vents spewing forth whatever the hell is within them, and sprinkled over all of it is a pale, sootish kind of moon dust stuff that I'm particularly uninterested in. Although, if you come at the right time, you will see Alchiba III up in the sky, which looks pretty dang cool. And the second biome is the frozen mountains. Now, this area is notably cooler. Haha, get it? Because it's frozen. The rocks are slightly more interesting and we can find those purple crystal clusters. And I think I came just at the right time. I always do, but just at the right time to see this very cool twinning of Alchiba III and the star Alchiba, mounted beautifully in the center by nothing other than a mountain. It looks so cool that even the sky's shocked. Anyway, something interesting that I did notice was that even though it's the frozen mountains, what we find on the flat area is still just that grey moon dust. It's not actually snow. But if we look off into the distance at the mountains are covered in snow. Now, Alchiba III-a has one trait, and that would be the pelted fields, which I found in this huge crater with some molten meteorite remains. With a similar thing that we saw earlier with the metal amalgam slag lumps, but these at their center are still hot, as we can find it there core a bubbling cauldron of metal, which hiss and spit smelted shards of liquid metallics. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour on this moon is the equivalent of 3 hours and 28 minutes of universal time, and 24 hours is the equivalent of 83 hours and 21 minutes universal time. Nothing too interesting there. And if we fully scan the moon, Alchiba III-a's survey data is worth 9,000 credits. And moving on to the next moon is Alchiba III-b. Its type is ice. It's got a gravity of 0.04, that's very low. Its temperature is cold, there's no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, no water, but it does have 2 resources. Those being helium-3, which is again a common/uncommon resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5, and the second is aluminum/aluminium, which is a common resource and has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 7. Now, Alchiba III-b has one biome, and that is craters. But it's the more interesting craters, with the pale pink sand and the orange-red ochre clay and stone, which looks rather akin to the surface of the moon Alchiba II-a, which we saw earlier on in the video. Although Alchiba III-b is slightly more saturated in color, that is. It's redder, brighter, more vibrant, which of course means that it's better. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 6 hours and 15 minutes universal time, and 24 hours is the equivalent of 150 hours and 1 minute universal time. And when you fully scan this moon, Alchiba III-b's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. Next up, we have Alchiba III-c, which is of course a moon of Alchiba III. Its type is barren, it's got a gravity of 0.14, its temperature is temperate, atmosphere is none, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, and the water is safe, unlike the tap water in LA. And this moon is packed with resources, as it has 8. The first of which is water, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Secondly is helium-3, common/uncommon resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. Then we have aluminium, with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 7. We can also find nickel, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. Then we have beryllium, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 12. And interestingly, if I remember correctly, beryllium is stronger and lighter than aluminium, but we don't use it in day-to-day stuff because it's toxic to humans. We can also find cobalt, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 12. Anyway, we can also find neodymium, which for my whole life I pronounced neodymium until I played Starfield and saw it was in fact called neodymium. So much like the metal I am dim, yes. Anyway, it is a rare resource with a mass of 0.8 but a value of 20. And finally, we can also find platinum, which is a rare resource with a mass of 0.8 and a value of 24. Now, Alchiba III-c has 2 biomes. The first of which is craters, which at face value looks pretty boring, but upon a closer inspection it's pretty weird. As well, yes, it's just sand and rocks and pretty flat, the majority of the sand appears to be a very pale green with strips of pale pink sand leprously dotted with patches of pale mustard sand. Now, given the overall paleness of all of these colors, it's pretty hard to spot, but if you really look closely, that's pretty weird. Green sand, what will they think of next? Now, the second and final biome is frozen craters, which, unlike some of the other moons we've seen, all of this is snow, all of it is ice. So much like my TV from Kogan, it is truly frozen. Somewhat interestingly, dotted about the place are these rather large impact craters, but apart from that, there's nothing of note here, except for some pretty spectacular sunsets. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 14 hours and 11 minutes universal time, and 24 hours is the equivalent of 340 hours and 15 minutes universal time. And when you fully survey Alchiba III-c, its survey data is worth 4,500 credits. Moving on to our next victim, Alchiba IV. Now, this planet's type is rock. It's got a gravity of 0.8, its temperature is cold, its atmosphere is standard M, which I'm assuming stands for methane. Its magnetosphere is weak, there's no fauna, no flora, the water is safe, and it has 7 resources. Firstly is water, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Secondly is copper, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. Then we have lead, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. We can also find uranium, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 14. There is also iridium, which is an uncommon resource and has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 14. Along with this, we can find tetrafluoride, which is a rare resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 18. And finally, we can find vanadium, which is a rare resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 24. Now, along with these resources, Alchiba IV has 3 biomes to offer us, the first of which is mountains, which quite frankly, these look like Australian mountains, aka hills. They're not super impressive, although that is good for exploration, as you don't have to climb literal mountains. Like some of the other celestial bodies we've seen so far, the sky and the sand and the landscape in general seem to merge in terms of their color palette, which is pretty cool to see. Now the second biome is sandy desert. And I personally found this rather interesting, is that it doesn't seem to be volcanic. The rocks don't look volcanic yet. All of the sand in this desert is black. Well, it's grey, but as far as sand goes, it's pretty dang black. I know there are some beaches in Iceland that have black pebbles, but I don't think it's black sand. Could be mistaken, but nonetheless, I don't think I've seen black sand before, and I like it. But along with the black sand, there are also some small black stones, and occasionally these shields of a lighter grey stone. And the third and final biome is frozen hills, which is of course my favorite and probably your favorite because it looks really cool. While the landscape is just snow and ice, well, the chunks of ice, the shapes look rather cool and interesting, but what really makes it is the sky, the color of which seems to go from blood orange to unripe grapefruit, casting a prismatic blanket of spiced honey across the landscape. Pair this with other celestial bodies in the sky, and we've got something pretty magical. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 3 hours universal time, which of course means that 24 hours equals 72 hours of universal time. And if you fully scan the planet, Alchiba IV's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. But now we will move on to Alchiba IV-a, which is of course the moon of the previous planet. Its type is rock, it's got a gravity of 0.36, its temperature is cold, the atmosphere is thin CO2, there is no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, the water is chemical, and it has 7 resources. Firstly is water, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Then we have copper, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. Then there is nickel, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. We can also find lead, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. There is also argon, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. We may also find fluorine, which is an uncommon resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 10. And finally, we can find cobalt, which is an uncommon resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 12. Now, Alchiba IV-a has 4 biomes, the first of which is the rocky desert, which is rather bland. There aren't really any vibrant colors or anything interesting in the landscape. Secondly, we have hills, which looks suspiciously like the rocky desert. Not much going on, not much color, although there are these strips of moderately grey dust or whatever that is. I can't really tell if it's mud or some kind of volcanic construction. The third biome is the Plateau, which is basically a flat version of the other 2 biomes. Although there are some more impressive rocks, slightly more interesting rocks, but even then I'd prefer to watch grass grow. And the final biome is the frozen plains, which have these beautiful marbled veins of ice, topped with meadows of white snow, acting like icing metaphorically and literally on a very, very cold cake. Kind of interestingly, I'm not sure what kind of weather event this was, but you'd expect white and blue, which you can still tell the snow and the ice is, but there's this orange air to the whole area. Now, this moon has 2 traits to offer us. The first is a frozen ecosystem, which I found in this frozen crevice with these uplifted fossils. A trait I've seen multiple times, but upon looking at this one for the first time, I noticed these rather interesting red fossils. Not sure if that's something that happens in real life, but if it is, I would like a red fossil. And the second trait is the pelted fields, which I found in this great crater dotted with chunks of amalgam metal, which is of course from a meteorite shower. And much like the other pelted fields we saw earlier, at the center of some of these clusters is still molten metal, bubbling and hissing away like a witch's cauldron. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 1 hour and 38 minutes universal time. So 24 hours is the equivalent of 39 hours and 21 minutes universal time. Nothing interesting here. And when fully scanned, Alchiba IV-a's survey data is worth 9,000 credits. And now we move on to the planet Alchiba V. Its type is rock, it's got a gravity of 0.52, its temperature is frozen, its atmosphere is thin N2, which I believe is nitrogen. I do have a big book of elements, but I haven't read it for many years. The magnetosphere is powerful. There is no fauna, no flora, and the water is chemical. There are also 5 resources that can be found here. The first of which is water, which is a common resource, which has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Secondly is lead, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. Then we have uranium, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 14. We can also find argon, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. And finally, we can find iridium, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.7 and a value of 14. Now, this planet has 4 biomes for us, the first of which is the sandy desert. And oh boy, if we thought the other place had green sand, well, this appears to be the planet of matcha tea. This faded viridian sand is very beautifully contrasted by these slabs of dark red or orange stone. And after looking around for a while, there are many different shades to this green sand. Some might teeter on the edge of blue. But let's not get into the whole, is that blue or is that green? I think overall we can agree it's green sand, which I'm very fond of. It's just super alien and weird. Now, the second biome is the rocky desert, which for the first time in this whole star system, we've seen something that wasn't sand, dirt, or a rock, as there appear to be these coral-like fingers clawing up out of the rocky surface. As we know, there is no flora on this planet, so these would appear to not be alive. So it's likely this is some kind of fossilized coral. But along with this aquatic ornamentation, we can find some pretty standard light brown sand and some grey stones. Although I do like the shapes of the stones, they're very rigid and angular. And some of the taller ones kind of look like the heads from Easter Island. So overall, while fairly barren, I do vibe with this biome. The third biome is mountains, which in terms of color is pretty standard, browns, reds, oranges, but we can quite frequently run across these huge clusters of blue crystals. But overall, not too interesting, not too disappointing, just living up to its name. They're mountains. And the fourth and final biome is the frozen plains, which has these beautiful sheets of perma-ice. There are large, proud mountains on the horizon, snow all over the ground, and there are also these large, sharp, jagged, pointy, kind of mega dagger ice formations sticking out of the surface, which I like. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 3 hours and 12 minutes universal time, and 24 hours is the equivalent of 76 hours and 39 minutes universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba V's survey data is worth 4,500. Next we have Alchiba V-a, which is of course a moon of the previous planet. Its type is barren, its gravity is 0.08, its temperature is cold, the atmosphere is none, magnetosphere none, fauna none, flora none, water none, but there are 4 resources, which are helium-3, which is a common/uncommon resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. We can also find iron, another common resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 8. We can also find alkanes, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 13. And we can also find the ever strangely spelt ytterbium, which is an exotic resource with a mass of 1.2 but a value of 38. Now, Alchiba V-a has one biome, and that is craters, which, while a very common biome on moons and looking pretty boring, I don't know why, but I like this one. Every now and then, Starfield just catches you. The lights at the right angle, the stars in the right spot, There's the right types of rocks, the right colors, it all comes together and you just go, damn, that's beautiful. I was also lucky and looked around at the right time and saw the planet Alchiba V rising from between these two rocks. A truly special moment that I can now share with you. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 14 hours and 58 minutes universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 359 hours and 4 minutes universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba V-a's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. And now we will move on to Alchiba VI, which is an ice giant, so we can't land on it. All we can do is scan it from orbit and collect its survey data, which is worth 4,500 credits. And this takes us onto Alchiba VI-a, of course a moon of the previous planet. Its type is ice, its gravity is 0.04, which I think is on par with the lowest we've seen so far. The atmosphere is none, the magnetosphere none, no fauna, no flora, and the water is chemical. But it does have 4 resources to offer us. The first of which is water, which we can find in the form of ice. This is, of course, a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. We can also find copper, which is a common resource with a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. We may also find fluorine, which is an uncommon resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 12. And finally, we can also find gold, which is a rare resource with a mass of 0.8 and a value of 24. Now, this moon has one biome, that being frozen dunes, which look like the perfect place for an AT-AT to trip over. As you would expect, we can find snow and big hunks of ice, which for some reason always remind me of that episode of Pingu in which he runs away from home and gets lost in the frozen wastes. The lumps of ice in that episode are eerily similar to the lumps of ice we see before us. But apart from a distant childhood memory of Pingu, there isn't really anything interesting here, although I did catch this magic moment with Alchiba VI, the ice giant, up in the sky above the frozen wastes. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 9 hours and 25 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 225 hours and 52 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VI-a's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. But now we'll be moving on to Alchiba VI-b, which is of course a moon of the planet we spoke about previously. Its type is ice, it's got a gravity of 0.16, its temperature is frozen. There is no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, but the water is safe. And it's got 3 resources to offer us. The first of which is water, which is of course a common resource, which has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. We may also find copper, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. And we can also find tetrafluorides, which is a rare resource, which has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 18. Now, Alchiba VI-b has one biome, and that is the frozen plains, which have these huge chunks of bed ice, whatever the ice equivalent of bedrock is, covered in white snow. And there are many variations to the rocks here. They're all pretty much the same in color, but there are little ones, there are medium ones, there are little medium ones, there are big ones, huge ones. I don't know if this is normal, but it just feels more varied than some of the other moons we come across. There are also these colossal ice shards, which are very similar to some we saw just earlier, but these are massive and therefore more impressive. Now, this moon has one trait, which is the crystalline crust trait, which I found in the form of a crystalline matrix, specifically a crystalline nucleation nodule, which was this rather beautiful oasis, this pool of water, crystal clear water and filled with actual crystals, which stand tall and proud, vibrantly glowing in the star's light, with a palette that I can only describe as sapphire, overall creating an absolutely gorgeous spot to stop and take in the sights. And the cherry on top was Alchiba VI, off in the distance the ice giant, floating there cerulean and cold, matching the color palette of the area we find ourselves in. Now, in regards to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 11 hours and 29 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 275 hours and 38 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, the survey data for Alchiba VI-b is worth 9,000 credits. Next, we have Alchiba VI-c, which is of course a moon. Its type is ice, it has a gravity of 0.3, its temperature is frozen, there is no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, and the water is, once again, safe. It has 3 resources to offer us, the first of which is water, which we can find in the form of ice. This is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Next, we have copper, which is a common resource and has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. And thirdly, and rather problematically, we have fluorine, which is an uncommon resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 12. Now, the reason I say it's problematic in the case of this moon is because I never actually found it. I did find plenty of patches on the ground which are highlighted for outpost building in which I could harvest the resource, again via an outpost, but in terms of a node that I could harvest through my player character, I never found it. I did come back to this moon 3 separate times, specifically with the mission to finally find some, and I never did. I have an hour of footage of me running around this moon and I never came across it. Now, the longest I've ever looked for a resource is maybe a minute or 2. I've never struggled finding any, so to go from a minute or 2 to an hour without finding it, I think this moon is bugged. At least when it comes to fluorine. Now, you've pretty much seen it all at this point, but it has one biome and that is frozen volcanic, which is a little bit Skyrim-esque. There's snow and there's some mountains and some rocks. Overall, pretty boring, but kind of nostalgic with the mountains on the horizon. Now, when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 39 hours, 41 minutes universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 952 hours and 19 minutes of universal time. So this moon goes round almost as slowly as Elder Scrolls releases. And when fully surveyed, Alchiba VI-c has a survey data value of 4,500. And now we move on to Alchiba VII, which is an ice giant. We can't land on it, all we can do is scan it from orbit. And when we do so, its survey data is worth 4,500 credits. Next is the first of its moons, which is Alchiba VII-a. Its type is ice, it's got a gravity of 0.15, its temperature is deep freeze, its atmosphere does not exist, its magnetosphere does not exist, there is no fauna, no flora, and the water is chemical. Now, this moon has 2 resources, the first of which is water, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. And secondly, we have copper, which is a common resource and has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. Now, Alchiba VII-a has one biome and that is frozen plains, which won't be able to fly in that thing. Sadly, that genius pun is actually probably the most exciting thing about this moon. There ain't much going on. There's snow and some ice. Although it is that kind of Pingu ice, so it is a little bit exciting. And when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 2 hours and 44 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 65 hours and 41 minutes universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VII-a's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. And now we move on to its sibling, Alchiba VII-b. This is of course a moon, its type is rock, it's got a gravity of 0.45, its temperature is cold, the atmosphere is thin M, which again I'm guessing is methane, which is pretty confusing because well, methane's a compound and it's represented by CH4, because it's 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. So if that is methane, it should be thin CH4. Anyway, the magnetosphere is none, the fauna is none, the flora is none, and the water is safe. And it's got 7 resources to offer us. The first of which is water, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. We can also find chlorine, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 6. There is also copper, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. We can also run across nickel, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. There is also lead, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. We may also find cobalt, which is an uncommon resource, which has a mass of 6 and a value of 12. And finally, there is also tetrafluorides, which is a rare resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 18. Now, Alchiba VII-b has 5 biomes, the first of which is the Wetlands. Now, I've seen my fair share of wetlands, and the wetlands here don't really look, to me, like wetlands. At first glance, it just kind of looks like a rocky desert. Upon a closer inspection, there are rather large sections of what I guess could be considered mud. So if we want to look at it, technically it is land and it is wet. But I feel like the name wetlands for a location that looks like this, it's kind of false advertising. But I did find some of these. Now, if you've seen my 10 things you didn't need to know about Skyrim about the Face on Mars episode, I'll link it above. At the end of that, we go to the Boneyard, which has these kind of H.R. Geiger, cosmic horror, Lovecraftian, weird fossils, bones, whatever they are. The ones in the Boneyard are much larger, like 20 times the size of these ones, but it is cool to see this asset again in game. Now, before we leave the wetlands, I'm actually at the coastal wetlands because this moon has an ocean. Here we can find golden sands and the lapping shore, peacefully slushing, I don't know if that's a word, but it is now, peacefully slushing away. Now, of course, this moon has no fauna, so we won't find any sea life. Nonetheless, it's a beautiful sight. Now, the second biome is Rocky Desert, which I think is my favorite one. As between the vibrant blue sky and the rich golden color of the stones and the sand, something about this biome just rustles up a sense of comfort and warmth. Not only that, but there are these very strange and rather interesting stone formations. I'm sure they are due to erosion over thousands if not millions of years, perhaps billions, who knows. But there are some very interesting shapes like this one, which is a pretty standard stone pillar, but then at the top there's this thin, long finger that sticks out. And all throughout this rocky desert, we can find numerous amounts of these oddly shaped rocky formations. So again, for me, this is definitely one of my favorite, if not my favorite, biomes we've seen so far in the Alchiba system. The next biome is hills, which is pretty boring. There is a strangely mottled, almost bruised looking sand, like a wine stain on white cloth, faded over the years but never truly washed out. And while the landscape was rather unfulfilling, I did see this beautiful vista of the ice giant Alchiba VII off on the horizon with one of the other moons up to the left. And for those of you with very keen eyes, there's another moon to the right. It's about the size of 2 pixels. And with a wider shot, we can see the third moon right up at the top there. And as beautiful as that is, when the most interesting thing about a landscape is what's in the sky, it probably sucks. Now, the fourth biome is mountains. This isn't too much more interesting, although I do appreciate the color variations. We have the same kind of sand, which looks a bit warmer due to the strange cloudy atmosphere. There are these bright, deep orange rocks, which create some interesting banding effects when we look at the different elevations with the paler sand sitting on top of it, kind of like stripes across the landscape. It's kind of interesting. And the fifth and final biome is the frozen hills. The ground is caked in snow, blinding white snow. It's whiter than my upper thigh, although less hairy, dotted with these dark stone fingers pointing up from the earth below. And I must say, for a place called the Frozen Hills, it's not that hilly. Unlike the Netherlands, which I was assured was flat until I jumped on a bike and found myself riding up and down hills constantly. Now, when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 8 hours and 34 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 205 hours and 38 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VII-b's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. And now we move on to one of those moons we saw in the sky, that being Alchiba VII-c. This is of course a moon of Alchiba VII. Its type is ice. It's got a gravity of 0.04, which again I think is triply tied with 2 other celestial bodies that we saw earlier on in the video. The temperature is deep freeze, the atmosphere is none, magnetosphere none, fauna none, Flora, none, water, chemical. Now it has 3 resources, one of which I find to be quite rare in game. Firstly, there is water, which we find in the form of ice. It is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. We can also find lead, plumbum, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. And finally, we can find mercury, which is a rare resource, has a mass of 0.8 and a value of 22. Now, Alchiba VII-c has one biome, that is the frozen plains. And yes, it lives up to the name. We have huge sheets of ice with snow on top of it. Nothing standoutish, just the general beauty of atmosphere-less moons. And when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 12 hours and 27 minutes of universal time, which means, of course, 24 hours is the equivalent of 298 hours and 51 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VII-c's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. And next we have this planet's fourth and final moon, Alchiba VII-d. Its type is ice, it has a gravity of 0.11, its temperature is deep freeze, its atmosphere is none, magnetosphere none, fauna none, flora none, and its water is safe. And it has two resources that we can find. Firstly is water, which can be found in the form of ice. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. And we can also find lead, again, plum bum, it's always funny. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. Now Alchiba VII-d has one biome, and that is frozen mountains. Luckily, the rather bland white landscape is brightened up a little with these beautiful large crystal formations, which have a deep plum-colored base and almost an orange ruby tip. I don't quite know how to describe that color on the tips. Now this moon has one trait, and that is the coralline landmass, which I found in the form of this beautiful coral forest in this small dale. And not to get pedantic, but I am, coral or corals are invertebrates, which are animals. They're not plants, they're not fungus, they are animals. So this moon does technically have fauna. Unless, of course, the coral is dead, in which case it just has bones or fossils of coral. But sitting at the top of this whole forest is a big flowery kind of thing, with some rather magical and effervescent particles blinking in and out of existence above it. Now, I will admit the rather large petal-like structures around the outside look kind of fungusy, and the thing in the middle definitely looks like a flower, or a plant at the very least. Which, as we know, coral is neither of those things, but whatever this is, it looks kind of alive, so I feel like there should be a flora or a fauna on this moon. Now, when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 13 hours and 49 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 331 hours and 39 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VII-d's survey data is worth 9,000 credits. Next, we have the planet Alchiba VIII. Its type is rock, it's got a gravity of 2.07, which as far as I can remember is the highest gravity I've ever seen in Starfield. Its temperature is deep freeze, its atmosphere is high N2, which would be nitrogen, its magnetosphere is very strong, there's no fauna, no flora, and no water. But it does have two resources to offer us. First up is helium-3, which is the common/uncommon resource that we've spoken about so much in this video. It has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. And the other resource that we can find is iron, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 8. Now, Alchiba VIII has one biome, and that is craters, which, while craters are pretty boring overall, I find this interesting because Alchiba VIII is a planet, not a moon. We tend to only ever find craters as a biome on moons, not on planets. So that's pretty weird. Plotted across this rather drab landscape, we can find plenty of these gas vents spewing their noxious fumes. The rocks are rather dark, the loam is rather dark, but what did catch my attention was the sky, as it is a rather vibrant pink, purple, magenta kind of color. Now this planet has one trait, and that is the frozen ecosystem, which I found in this frozen crevasse, or more specifically with these uplifted fossils. A trait we did see earlier on in the video, so nothing we haven't seen before, although still beautiful in its own fossilized way. Anyway, when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 3 hours universal time, which of course means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 72 hours universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VIII's survey data has a value of 9,000 credits. But now we move on to its first moon, Alchiba VIII-a. Its type is ice, it's got a gravity of 0.04, which is now quadruply tied as the lowest gravity we've seen in this video and the lowest gravity I can think of. Its temperature is deep freeze, no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, and the water is safe. There are two resources we can find here, the first of which is water, which we can find in the form of ice. This is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. And the second resource is lead, plumber. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. Now, Alchiba VIII-a has one biome, and that is frozen craters. And with no atmosphere or clouds, the light coming from the sun is almost blinding against the snow. It's whiter than a banker's nostril. There isn't anything too interesting, although we do find big lumps of that metal amalgam that we've seen a couple of times throughout this star system. And while fairly boring overall, I did capture this magical moment rising over this ice cliff, only to see almost completely enveloped in shadow. This. I don't know if this is Alchiba VIII, the planet, or one of the other moons, but whatever it is, it looks pretty fancy. Now, Alchiba VIII-a has one trait, and a very special trait. A trait that I'm going to cover in my next 10 things you didn't need to know about Starfield, so you're getting a sneak peek if you made it this far. Now, this trait is called Slushy Subsurface Seas, which I've only ever found once before in 400 hours of Starfield, so it is quite rare, this trait. But you have eyes, you can see how magical this looks. These two great frozen shards sticking up like supporting pillars of a cromlech, with this rather odd rainbow prismatic light glowing up from the pool of water below it. Now this is where it gets interesting. As we can see, there's some water, maybe a bit of seaweed, okay. But with the power of console commands, if we go into this pool of water, it hides within it a bedazzling chromatic paradise. Between the ice walls and the long strands of kelp, painted brilliantly with every color of the rainbow. It truly is a sight to behold. It's stunning. But the weird thing is, you would never see it, because in Starfield you can't go underwater. If you try and jump in here, you'll just float on the surface. So most players, unless they use console commands, will never ever be able to see the beauty within these slushy subsurface seas traits. So I am very glad that I was able to share it with you. Now, when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 1 hour and 53 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 45 hours and 3 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VIII-a's survey data is worth 9,000 credits. And now we move on to Alchiba VIII-b. Its type is barren, it's got a gravity of 0.28, its temperature is deep freeze, it has no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, and no water. But it does have two resources. The first of which is Helium-3, the classic common/uncommon resource that has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. And the second resource is Aluminium or aluminum. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 7. Now Alchiba VIII-b has one biome, that is craters. And well, this is the classic moon crater biome. Light grey dusty dirt, dark grey dusty dirt, some grey rocks, that's it. So when it comes to moons, well, this one is definitely not full. But when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 4 hours and 54 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 117 hours and 44 minutes universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba VIII-b's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. Next we have Alchiba IX. Now this is a gas giant, so we cannot land on it. All we can do is scan it from orbit and collect its survey data, which is worth 4,500 credits. Next we have Alchiba IX-a. This is a moon of the previous planet. Its type is ice, it's got a gravity of 0.1, its temperature is deep freeze, there's no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, there's no fauna, no flora, and the water is safe. It also has two resources for us. The first of which is water, which we can find in ice form. This is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. And the second resource that we can find is Argon. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. Now Alchiba IX-a has one biome, and that is frozen mountains. which at this point, let's not beat around the bush. That's exactly what we have here. There's a mountain, there's ice. Put them together, we've got frozen mountains. Now when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 3 hours and 11 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 76 hours and 25 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba IX-a's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. And now we move on to our final planet, and that is Alchiba X. Now this is a gas giant, so we cannot land on it. All we can do is scan it from orbit. When we do so, we'll get its survey data, which is worth 4,500 credits. Now we have Alchiba X-a. This is of course a moon of the previous planet. Its type is ice, it's got a gravity of 0.31, its temperature is deep freeze, there's no atmosphere, no magnetosphere, no fauna, no flora, and the water is chemical, which I always find to be a funny way to label water, as water is a chemical compound. It's pure chemistry. All water is chemical. Anyway, this moon has 3 resources. The first of which is water, which we can find in ice form. This is a common resource with a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. Secondly, we can find copper, which is a common resource, has a mass of 0.6 and a value of 10. And thirdly and finally, we can find gold. This is a rare resource, has a mass of 0.8 and a value of 24. Anyway, Alchiba X-a has one biome, and that is frozen hills. Which, while there are little mounds that are maybe 6-7 feet tall, I wouldn't quite call them hills. As we saw with one of the other celestial bodies we covered in this video, the frozen hills, it's kind of lacking the hills bit. Although we do have these rather cool chunks of Pingu ice that we've seen a few times. I do enjoy them. Now when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 1 hour and 56 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 46 hours and 27 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba X-a's survey data is worth 4,500 credits. And that brings us to our final subject, Alchiba X-b. Now this is of course a moon, its type is rock, it's got a gravity of 0.74, its temperature is temperate, its atmosphere is standard O2, in brackets, tox, I'm guessing that's toxic. There is no magnetosphere, there's no fauna, no flora, and the water is biological. So it's interesting that it's the right temperature and it's got biological water, but it doesn't have any fauna. I guess that toxic atmosphere kind of nipped that in the bud. Anyway, it has 4 resources. The first of which is water. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 4. We may also find lead. This is a common resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 10. There is also argon. This is another common resource, has a mass of 0.5 and a value of 5. And finally, we can also find tetrafluorides. This is a rare resource, has a mass of 0.7 and a value of 18. Now Alchiba X-b has 2 biomes, the first of which is the frozen mountains. We've seen plenty of this, but I feel like this shot in particular, it almost looks real. I think it's the perfect combination of lighting and the distant haze. It just looks like real life. But apart from impressive in-game lighting and atmospherics, the frozen mountains we've seen before. There's mountains, there's snow. Put them together, we got some frozen mountains. Now the second biome is swamps. Now much like that other place that we looked at that had wetlands, I don't find this swamp particularly swampy. First of all, not an ogre to be seen. Secondly, it just looks like a desert. Although I do quite enjoy those mountains off in the distance. Interestingly, I kept finding these small crags with red stone that were cracked open with fire spewing out from within it. Which is cool, but again, not swampy. There are, however, big slabs of this porous stone, which appears to be slightly green in places, which suggests there might be algae or moss growing on top of it. You know, it looks like the kind of rock that if you stepped on it, you would slip over instantly and fall into the creek. Now the pallid pink sand looks like it might be wet, but it looks more dry to me than wet. Even then, I don't know if some wet sand equals a swamp. If we had to pair this biome visually with any kind of wet scenario, I would say a beach. And speaking of, although it's not a biome, this planet does have oceans. So that means that there is a coastal region, which, again, to sound like a broken record, I know isn't a biome. But the coastal region has rock types, rock colorations, and rock formations that aren't found in either of the other two biomes. Now, of course, this moon does not have any fauna, therefore we won't find any sea life, but it's always nice to see a beach. Now, Alchiba X-b has two traits, the first of which is the pelted fields, which I found in this big crater with a stony meteor impact site, which, as we've seen a couple of times, there are these big chunks of amalgamated melted metal. At the center of some of them, there is a boiling cauldron of magma, lava, or I guess if this is due to the meteor, it would actually be liquid metal, rather than being a volcanic event. And the second trait is, I'll tell you in a second, but it's got this weird thing that a lot of the traits have in Starfield. As from the planet map, it says that it's the global glacial recession trait. When you bring up the scanner and hover over it, it's called the melted glacier, and also with the scanner up in the information box, it's called the glacial remnant. As I said, a lot of traits in Starfield have this, where it's one trait, but it's got 3 different names in 3 different places. So make of that what you will, because as a whole, its name is Global Glacial Recession Melted Glacier Glacial Remnant. Anyway, I've always been particularly fond of this trait because it just looks lively. It looks interesting, and there's stuff happening. There's water spurting out of the ground. There is, of course, this huge pool of water, which is always a staple for creating a sense of fantasy and magic. And obviously, how could you miss it? The big ice shard that's still standing proud. Now, when it comes to time, 1 hour is the equivalent of 5 hours and 12 minutes of universal time, which means that 24 hours is the equivalent of 124 hours and 43 minutes of universal time. And when fully scanned, Alchiba X-b's survey data is worth 9,000 credits. And with that, we have concluded our tour of the Alchiba star system. We have looked at all 10 planets and all 18 moons. So I do hope that you enjoyed it, or at the very least that you learned something new. Personally for me, I just found it was a shame that there were not any fauna or flora on any of the planets or moons. I mean, in total there was 28. Moons and planets combined, 28. Not a single one had any plants or any animals. But such are the risks in randomly selecting star systems, I guess. However, there were still some interesting things to see. So what was your favorite planet or moon? For me personally, my favorite visual in the whole star system was on Alchiba V with the green sand. I don't know what it was. It's just so weird and obscure. It definitely ruffles up a sense of fantasy. And given it's been 4,000 years since Skyrim came out, I'm needing some fantasy right now. So I do hope that you found this video very helpful. I do hope you learned something new, or that you just found it enjoyable. Let me know if you enjoyed this video. It took a very long time to make. And be sure to let me know what your favorite thing in the star system is, and if there's any particular star systems you think I should cover in this Explorer's Guide to the Galaxy. If you did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing. All of the Starfield videos that I've already done can be found down in the description via the Starfield playlist link. Down there, you can also find all of my social media links. Be sure to check them all out. If you did enjoy this video and you would like to support my channel in a more personal way, feel free to leave a super thanks right here on YouTube. That would be greatly appreciated. So I would like to thank you very much for watching. I've been Camel, and I will see you very shortly in the next video. I'll see you there soon.